So many of us try to protect our true feelings and don't like to share with anyone how we actually feel because so many of us like to keep our hearts protected. I was one of those people for a really long time. To have deeper, more meaningful connections, I found that it really elevated my relationships, not only with my family and my friends, but also with myself. Hey, welcome to episode number 53 of the Self-Improvement Room. I'm your host, Kristy Davis, and today we are talking about unlocking deeper connections with family, friends, and ourselves so that we can have better, more meaningful, more engaged and connected relationships. We have created the Self-Improvement Room Facebook community. We'll leave the link in the show notes. If you head to that link, you can join our community where we talk about personal growth and we talk about our experiences and our difficulties and struggles, and we just support each other. And we hope to see you in the Self-Improvement Room Facebook group. And if you haven't already, make sure you follow the podcast. All right, let's dive into today's episode. We are talking about experiencing or learning to experience deeper connections so we can have more connected relationships. Connection is a basic human need, and I think on some level we all crave meaningful relationships, whether that's with your partner, with a family member, with a friend, with somebody at work. But how do we move beyond that surface level? How do we move beyond those surface level interactions so we can create deeper connections that actually make us feel more fulfilled? Of course, sometimes you're not going to want to create those deeper level conversations. It's okay to leave it at surface level with some people, but that's our choice. But we want to be able to forge these deeper connections if that's something that we desire. And I think a lot of us really struggle with that concept. We really struggle to go beyond surface level because we're worried about what people think, what they might feel, and how they might react towards something that we say, which leaves us vulnerable. And that's where the key lies. It lies in vulnerability. In sharing more of who you are with the people around you, you start to let people see the real you. That's scary. And that includes your hopes and your fears and your struggles. And then you open the door to being more authentic. And then you create more fulfilling relationships. So what I want to explore in this episode is how sharing more of yourself can actually create better relationships. Because a lot of us are like, yeah, I don't actually need anything more than surface level. But sometimes you just don't know that you do because you haven't experienced it. So let's talk about how it can strengthen your bond with family and friends and how it can lead to deeper connections. We will also look at the power of vulnerability, and Brene Brown's got some amazing work which I'll touch on in this episode around vulnerability. The importance of communication, which we also discussed in last week's episode number 52. And I want to discuss some strategies for opening up in a way that creates that trust so that it doesn't feel so difficult. But we do have to remember being vulnerable isn't an easy thing, and I think that takes practice. So let's just talk a little bit about vulnerability first. And I think that at the heart of deep connection is vulnerability. And vulnerability is the willingness to show up as your authentic self. And that's something that is one of my major values. It's showing up as my authentic self. And sometimes that's really hard. Sometimes I don't want to be authentic because it means making difficult decisions, holding strong, difficult boundaries, and it makes me feel vulnerable. But vulnerability does at times feel risky and uncomfortable because it's really about letting others see or hear your true thoughts and feelings without hiding behind that mask that we've talked about before on the podcast, or trying to be someone or something that you're not. I think a lot of us fear vulnerability because it can feel like a weakness. And again, back to Brené Brown's research, she talks about how shame is really locked up in vulnerability because people do see it as a weakness. We worry that if we reveal too much, we might be judged or rejected or hurt. So we try to protect ourselves. But being vulnerable isn't weakness. It's a strength. It takes courage to be open and honest, especially in a world that encourages us to wear masks and to keep up our guard. So when you allow yourself to be vulnerable in your relationships, you create space for that deeper connection that we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. By sharing some of your deepest thoughts and feelings, you're inviting others to do the same. Sometimes they probably won't, because again, vulnerability is a strength, and it's a hard thing to do or be. Over time, with the same people, if you continue this and you encourage this, then they will begin to open up, and that mutual openness then fosters that trust and empathy and understanding, and they are the ingredients for a strong, meaningful relationship. So let's look at how being vulnerable strengthens your relationships. Number one, it builds trust. When you share your true, authentic self with someone, you signal that you trust them with your thoughts and your emotions. And that's a huge thing, because we all know how easily that can be taken advantage of. If you choose the right people, the trust is often reciprocated, and that creates a foundation for a much more secure and connected relationship. But that's something that you test the waters with. You don't meet a new person and go in with everything vulnerable that you can and tell them all about yourself. That's not vulnerability. That's dangerous. Trust is something that we build up over time. And to be vulnerable, you need to have that trust, I believe. When I was doing some of the Brené Brown work a couple of years ago, I found that my two biggest values were authenticity and integrity. And I hold myself to those. And sometimes I wish I didn't, because I think it's very hard to show up authentically. And vulnerability invites authenticity. When you let your guard down, others feel more comfortable doing the same. So you're really leading people. You're leading people and showing them how you want to communicate and interact. And that leads to far more open, honest, and genuine interactions where both of you feel like you're seen and heard for who you are. There is nothing worse than trying to fit in with a group of people by pretending to be somebody you're not, because you feel like that's the only way they're going to like you. Being vulnerable, hence the reason vulnerability is so difficult. And vulnerability also, number 3, deepens emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy grows when you share deeper feelings and experiences. So when you open up about things that you fear, your dreams, the things that you struggle with, you create a space for that emotional closeness that goes beyond that surface level connection. And I think to have a truly deep and meaningful relationship, especially within a romantic relationship, you really need to be deeper than surface level. And you need to feel comfortable and vulnerable to open up and share how you really feel. And by doing that, you're creating the space and inviting your partner in and saying, I'm creating a safe space for you to be who you are, because I want to know who you are on a deeper level than that surface. As I said, vulnerability will probably feel very uncomfortable at first. but it is absolutely the gateway but it is absolutely the gateway for more meaningful relationships. When you take on vulnerability, you give others permission to do the same. All right, moving on to communication. This is kind of like the bridge to deeper understanding. So sharing more of yourself in relationships requires effective communication. Sometimes this can be a bigger problem than vulnerability, I feel. But without open and honest communication, it's very difficult to express your true self or understand the needs and the feelings of others. Communication serves, I think, as the bridge that connects your inner world to those around you, allowing for that greater understanding and connection. And I think it's important to say and to realize that effective communication goes beyond simply just talking. It involves listening to actually hear and understand rather than listening to respond. It involves empathy, so really putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand things from their perspective. And it involves emotional intelligence and regulation. So that means you have to understand a little bit about emotions so you can understand the context of the communication. When you're able to communicate openly and authentically, once again, you're creating that safe space for a deeper connection. So the key elements of effective communication are active listening. Deep connection requires active listening, and that means fully focusing on what the other person is saying without interrupting and without planning a response. Active listening shows that you value the other person's thoughts and their feelings, which again creates trust and understanding. Number 2 key element is expressing emotions. Don't be afraid to share your emotions in a relationship because, again, that's about being vulnerable. And some people feel deep shame about their emotions and others don't know how to express them at all. But we have to work on sharing our emotions in a relationship. And that means you have to have the confidence to maybe stumble over those emotions. Try to figure out, again, if you have a safe space to do this, it's much easier. Trying to figure out how to convey your emotions to the person you're talking with. So whether you are happy, whether it's fear, frustration, or sadness, expressing your feelings, those emotions, helps others understand what's going on inside of you, like your inner world. And by being open about your emotions, you really do create a far more authentic and deeper connection. Non-verbal communication is a huge thing as well, and they teach this to therapists. Sometimes what we say is just as important as what we do. So pay attention to non-verbal cues, so body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, because these non-verbal signals can either enhance or hinder your connection that you're trying to build. So if you're all closed off and you are like, you're showing or giving that vibe that, I'm not really listening, I don't really care, even if you do, but you're protecting yourself, you may give off that non-verbal cue that you're not ready or willing, or you're not a safe person to share that information with. So the non-verbal communication is probably just as important as the verbal communication. Clear and compassionate communication is honestly essential for unlocking those deeper connections. By expressing openly, so when you're talking, by communicating openly and listening with empathy, again, you're building that trust and you're building that intimacy and you're building a mutual understanding in your relationships. And you really gain a lot more respect when you can communicate on that level. The next thing is overcoming the fear of rejection. A lot of us don't want a deeper connection or anything beyond surface level because we are very afraid of being rejected. And that's probably one of the biggest barriers to sharing more of yourself in any relationship. And it's a natural worry to be concerned about sharing or revealing too much. Having ADHD, you share way more of your inside thoughts, what I call your inside thoughts, than you should. And, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not a good thing. But we do worry that we might be judged or rejected based on, what we are sharing. But it's important to remember, if you choose the right people especially, that you will over time feel safe. But it's just as important to remember that rejection is also a part of life. And that does not define your self-worth. Your rejection never defines your worth. Simply embracing the possibility of rejection can be a huge step in the growth process, because when you stop trying to please everyone and you start being who you are, you attract people who appreciate you for who you really are. And not everyone's going to connect with your authentic self, and that's okay. You don't have to have a deep connecting bond or relationship with everybody that comes into your life. The goal is to build relationships, though, based on mutual trust, understanding, and acceptance. And that requires you to show up as your true self, even in the face of potential rejection. So let's just touch on how you can overcome that fear of rejection. Number one, challenging your negative thoughts. When the fear of rejection starts to creep in, I like to challenge those thoughts. Remind yourself that your worth is not defined by other people's opinions. So even if someone doesn't respond positively to you being vulnerable, it doesn't mean that you're not worthy of love or connection. It just means that they are not your people. Number two, try to focus on growth. Instead of seeing rejection as a failure, see it as an opportunity to grow. And that really builds resilience. Each experience, whether it's positive or negative, teaches you about yourself and what you need in relationships. And by taking on that rejection and embracing it as a learning experience, you can approach relationships with, as I said, greater resilience and confidence. And number three, this is a huge one, practice self-compassion. Be kind to yourself, especially when facing rejection. It's very easy to be hard on yourself when things don't go as planned, but self-compassion helps us bounce back from disappointment. Treat yourself with the same kindness, compassion, and understanding that you would your best friend. And I've really worked hard on that, and I do that all of the time. And there is a massive difference in my self-worth. Overcoming the fear of rejection takes time and practice. It's like building muscles. But it is a crucial step to unlocking those deeper, more profound connections and relationships. When you learn to let go of that need for external validation and you embrace who you really are, you create conditions for a more authentic and more meaningful relationship. The next thing I want to talk about when we're creating relationships is the role of boundaries. Because when we start to trust people and let them in our space, we can often let our guard down in regard. When our boundaries start to come down, our guard starts to come down, which is okay. But we have to maintain our boundaries. They can't come down as well. So while vulnerability and openness are essential for those deeper connections, it's very, very important. In fact, it's crucial to maintain boundaries, to maintain healthy boundaries in your relationships. Boundaries are the limits that you set yourself to protect your emotional and your mental well-being. They help ensure that your relationships are balanced and respectful without having to sacrifice your sense of self-worth. A lot of people mistakenly believe that setting boundaries will push others away and create distance in relationships. But I've found that it is actually the opposite. Healthy boundaries strengthen relationships because they create respect and trust and mutual understanding. People will gain respect for you when you have strong, healthy boundaries. And if they don't, then there's a very good hint there that they are not the right type of person that you want in your life. When you set clear boundaries, you're showing other people that you value yourself and you value your needs. And most times, people will respect that, but you have to communicate that boundary. Otherwise, people will take advantage. And half of the time, they won't even realize. And you will end up resentful. So let's talk a little bit about how boundaries enhance your relationships. Number one, boundaries promote mutual respect. They establish a framework for the respect in your relationships. So when both sides understand and respect each other's limits, it starts to create a foundation for trust and connection. Number two, as I said, talking about resentment, boundaries help prevent resentment. Without boundaries, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, easy for people to take advantage of you, and most of the time, it's inevitable to become resentful. So setting boundaries helps prevent those negative emotions from building up, and that allows for healthier and more balanced relationships. When you know that you've put boundaries in place and you're going to stick to them, you know that your boundaries will be respected and you feel more comfortable opening up and sharing your authentic self. Boundaries are not barriers. They are guidelines that allow you to create relationships that you can feel safe in, that you can build trust and respect and understanding. Now, when you are looking at sharing more of yourself and opening up, you have to understand that it requires a willingness to do that. But I guess the question is, how do you do that? How do you feel safe showing up authentically? So let's just talk about a couple of practical strategies that you can use to share more of yourself. Number one, I suggest starting small. If you're not used to being vulnerable, just start really little. Just share a little bit more about yourself. Maybe your thoughts or your feelings or your experiences with someone you trust. As you build confidence in opening up and sharing that, you can gradually share more. So just start small. Try being honest about your needs. Don't ever be afraid to communicate your needs in a relationship. That's different from being narcissistic or wanting everything your way. It just means that you share what you need from a relationship. It's up to the other person whether they can meet those needs, but you also need to make sure that your needs are practical and that they don't disrespect the other person within your relationship. So whether you need emotional support or quality time or space to reflect, be honest about those needs, and that really does help create a more balanced and fulfilling connection. You want to feel fulfilled. So we're looking for balanced and fulfilling connections. Number three, embrace imperfection. Nobody is perfect. So striving for perfection in relationships can be completely exhausting. Embrace those imperfections and allow other people to see them. You're only human. By letting people see your imperfections, you're showing them that it's okay not to be perfect. And that is very relatable. And lastly, opening up and sharing more of yourself just takes practice and patience. So when you are talking with people and really trying to open up, remember that it's a slow process. It can be fast for some people, but generally it's a slow process, and it's something that you have to get used to doing. You have to build a habit. To communicate well is a habit. So make sure that you continue to practice and make sure you are kind and patient with yourself. It's really one of the most powerful ways to build and elevate your relationships. And when you allow others to see the real you, you create the conditions for deeper connection, deeper trust, and more intimacy. I think at the core of every meaningful relationship is the willingness to be open and vulnerable and authentic. So by sharing more of yourself to others, oftentimes you'll find they start to do the same because they feel like you're creating a safe space for them. And that's kind of, I guess, how therapists work. But when you embrace vulnerability and you communicate openly and you set healthy boundaries and you work on overcoming the fear of rejection, you're then creating conditions for relationships that will really fulfill and elevate you as a person. So out of all of this, if nothing else, you are growing as a person. You are elevating who you are. And at the end of the day, when we do that, I think naturally people are drawn to us. All right, speaking of people being drawn to us, make sure you join our Facebook community. It's a great place to meet new people who are on the personal growth journey. We'll leave the link in the show notes. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you click follow so you know when the next episode is available. So make sure you come back in a fortnight, and until then, stay safe and stay well.